The morning of December 27th, the village of Kingsbridge awoke to a cold silence that stretched far beyond the usual winter hush. Snow still blanketed the hedgerows from the Christmas Eve flurry, and the small cottages were rimmed with frost. But something else hung in the air, something weightier than weather. A police car was parked awkwardly in front of Hawthorne Cottage, its blue lights swirling dimly against the grey dawn. The little cottage belonged to Mrs. Beatrice Ellingham, the widow of the late Colonel Horace Ellingham, who had passed some 15 years earlier under completely unremarkable circumstances, heart failure and a fondness for port. Since then, Mrs. Ellingham had become something of a fixture in Kingsbridge society. Punctual at church, generous to the vicar's raffle, and famous for her goose stuffed with chestnuts every Christmas. She had hosted the same traditional dinner for nearly a decade, inviting the same 4 guests, neighbours and old friends of her late husband. But this year, someone had died at the table. Not Mrs. Ellingham, number she was still quite alive, seated in her drawing room in a velvet armchair, looking every bit the grieving hostess. Her white curls were pinned neatly, her expression drawn, her hands shaking as she offered a policeman a saucer of tea. "No, no, I serve the same dishes I always do," she insisted, voice thin with disbelief. "The same pudding, the same wine, and they were all in good spirits. We toasted Horace, as we always do." The body in question belonged to Major Percival Brent, a former artillery officer with a booming voice and a stiff gait. He had slumped forward during dessert, face pressed into a half-eaten slice of plum pudding. The other guests, Miss Ada March, a retired schoolmistress, Mr. Julian Fletcher, a solicitor with a fine moustache, and Reverend Lionel Hargrove, had all leapt up in horror. But the Major was already gone. Choked, it seemed. Not a single mark on him. No wound. No sign of violence. The pudding naturally became the focus. It had been portioned equally, served from the same dish, doused in brandy, and flambéed with some ceremony. No one else had been affected, not even a stomachache. Dr. Raleigh, the village GP, had declared it a sudden cardiac event, but something about it sat uneasily with Sergeant Carrick, the local officer who'd arrived first on the scene. He'd seen something peculiar, something he couldn't quite reconcile, and so a discreet phone call was made to a certain lady in St. Mary Mead. When Miss Marple arrived at Hawthorne Cottage the following afternoon, snowflakes clung like pearls to the brim of her hat. She was escorted in by Sergeant Carrick, who looked both relieved and mildly sheepish. "I dare say, I'm not sure if it's anything at all," he admitted as they stood in the cold dining room, its table still set, the untouched wine glasses catching the dim light. "Doctor says it's natural, but it's the way." Mrs. Ellingham acted. "Calm, you know? Too calm." Miss Marple, in her dove-grey coat, made no comment on the widow's calmness. Her pale blue eyes took in everything, the waxy white china, the gleaming silver carving knife, the faint, sweet reek of brandy lingering in the air. She paused longest by the pudding dish, still sitting on a sideboard beneath its silver dome. "It's curious," she murmured, lifting the lid. "You know, one always hides sixpences in a plum pudding. A tradition going back generations." Carrick nodded. "She did, apparently. 1 sixpence in 1 slice." "Indeed. A solitary coin. Not terribly generous odds, are they?" She smiled faintly, then turned. "And who found the coin?" "Ada March," Carrick replied. "She didn't swallow it, thank the Lord. She wrapped it in her napkin, apparently. Said she was going to keep it." Miss Marple turned the idea over. "And the Major, Percival Brent, where was he sitting?" Carrick motioned to the end chair, closest to the window. "There, opposite Mrs. Ellingham." Marple sat in his chair, folded her gloved hands. "Tell me, was the pudding served by the hostess, or passed around?" "She served it," said Carrick. "Straight from the dish. Same spoon, same brandy, same everything. Nobody noticed anything strange." "But he died before taking his second bite," Miss Marple said softly. "Which means, whatever happened, it was in the pudding, or perhaps something else entirely." Carrick frowned. "But nothing was found in the pudding. We sent samples off just to be sure. No poison, no toxins. Even had a dog sniff the plate. Nothing." "Yes," she mused. "That's rather the point." The coroner's report confirmed the cause of death was asphyxiation, but from a foreign object, not food. A small, dense item had become lodged in the Major's trachea, blocking the airway cleanly. No one had known what it was yet. The pathologist's notes were still pending. But that evening Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire at her bed and breakfast, face calm but thoughtful. She had just begun turning over a new row when a knock came at her door. Sergeant Carrick again, eyes wide. "They've identified the object," he said breathlessly. "It was a coin, a sixpence." "Aha," said Miss Marple. "Then I believe we're dealing with murder, Sergeant. Quite deliberate, and very clever." Carrick blinked. "But how?" The coin was supposed to be in Ada March's pudding. She had it. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low. "Not necessarily. Someone only said it was there. In truth, there may have been two coins. One safe and one deadly. Slipped into a slice, timed with precision, intended for a single person." Carrick's brows furrowed. "And you think it was meant for Brent?" "No," she said. "I think it was meant for someone else entirely." There it was, the twist in the tale, the puzzle piece that no one had seen yet. Mrs. Ellingham's Christmas dinner had become a deadly game of chance. But if Major Brent wasn't the target, then who had the killer intended to die? And more importantly, why? Miss Marple had seen enough village dramas to know that nothing at a table was ever truly accidental. Behind the polite toasts and crisp linens, someone had served death by hand and wrapped it in a crust of tradition. The question now was, who? And what terrible secret had they killed to keep hidden? It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple returned to Hawthorne Cottage. The lane was slick with sleet, the sky heavy with the bruised clouds of another oncoming storm. She was met at the door not by Sergeant Carrick this time, but by the widow herself, Beatrice Ellingham, still immaculate in her morning cardigan, though a touch of fatigue showed in the set of her shoulders. "I'm afraid the police have been and gone, Miss Marple," she said with strained politeness, stepping aside. "There's very little left to investigate, they say. A tragic accident." Miss Marple gave a mild nod as she stepped inside. "Yes, accidents at Christmas do seem to catch us off guard. The very season makes them feel more unnatural somehow, wouldn't you agree?" Mrs. Ellingham didn't respond. She led her guest back to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in its marble grate, and a tea service lay untouched on a low table. The same untouched state that everything in the house seemed to maintain. Perfect, preserved, slightly too careful. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the tea tray, noting the arrangement of cups. 5 again. 1 extra, still polished and waiting. "Forgive me," said Miss Marple, settling in, "but I do hate to intrude. It's only that something about Major Brent's death nags at me, as if we've missed something obvious." The widow poured tea with stiff grace. "The poor man choked. It's dreadful, but the doctor said his heart gave out as well. I suppose it was simply his time." "Yes, a very tidy conclusion." Miss Marple sipped. "You knew him well, I imagine." "Oh, yes. He was a close friend of Horace. We've kept in touch ever since, every Christmas. He came to dinner." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the flames. "And you serve the pudding yourself, don't you?" "Of course. It's tradition. But not tradition to serve a second coin, surely." Beatrice Ellingham hesitated. Her hand paused halfway toward the sugar bowl, just long enough to betray a fracture in her poise. "I don't know what you mean." "A second sixpence, the one that killed the Major. Slipped into his pudding, perhaps, not by accident. Strange that no one saw it, though the pudding was sliced in full view." "I didn't see anything," she said, voice tighter now. "Neither did Ada. Or Julian." Or Lionel. Miss Marple tilted her head. "And you were quite sure he was the one who would get that particular slice?" Beatrice blinked. "What are you suggesting?" But Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room instead, her gaze lingering on the framed photos above the mantel, one of the late Colonel in his dress uniform, another of a much younger Beatrice seated in a garden, sunlight falling on her hat. Then she stood. "I wonder," she said mildly, "might I see the kitchen?" The request was not refused, but neither was it welcomed. Beatrice led her with stiff steps down a short hallway to a warm, tiled kitchen filled with the faint smell of cloves and sherry. Everything was in its place, but that was the problem. Everything was too perfect. Miss Marple examined the countertops, noting the gleaming brass scales, the hung copper pans, the untouched spice rack. But her attention landed at last on a small shelf near the pantry, a row of bottles neatly labelled. She pointed to one labelled saltpetre. "You don't see that often in a domestic kitchen," she said pleasantly. "Old remedy for curing meats." Beatrice hesitated. "I use it for pickling." "I see. And the other spices, do you grind them yourself?" Beatrice stiffened. "Yes, I like to prepare everything fresh." Miss Marple turned slowly, studying the widow's expression. "One must be very precise in that sort of work. I remember a dear friend, Mrs. Lanning from Westover, accidentally swapped her ground cinnamon with powdered calomel once, made the vicar violently ill, and there was no label to warn her." "I'm quite careful," Beatrice replied, a little too quickly. Yes, I imagine you are." Miss Marple wandered slowly back into the hallway, but as she passed a small side table by the stairs, something caught her eye. A handkerchief, folded, but stained faintly with something brown. She lifted it gently. "Ah," she said softly. "This isn't yours, I think. No embroidery. Men's style." Beatrice glanced over her shoulder and frowned. Percival used those awful old handkerchiefs. Always had tobacco stains on them. Miss Marple turned it in her hand. There was a faint scent of plums and burnt sugar. Brandy, perhaps. Or pudding. "Strange place to find it," she murmured, tucking it back where it lay. "Not the dining room, nor his pocket." Beatrice said nothing. They returned to the drawing room just as a knock came at the front door. It was Reverend Hargrove, flustered and flushed with cold, holding his hat in both hands. Miss Marple watched closely as the vicar greeted Beatrice with evident awkwardness, then turned to her with surprise. "I didn't know you were here, Miss Marple," he said. "Yes, just a brief visit," she replied. "I wanted to offer my condolences." He nodded, but his eyes flicked briefly to the widow. Something tight passed between them. Guilt or fear? "I only stopped by," the vicar said quickly, "to ask about the church flowers." Mrs. Ellingham had promised to arrange the poinsettias. I haven't quite had time," she said, voice thinner now. "No, of course not," he said hurriedly. "Forgive me." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. "You must be very tired, dear, hosting such a tragic dinner. But you know, I do wonder if the Major's death wasn't the only thing worth investigating." Reverend Hargrove looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "There's something curious in the pudding business. That coin. Why put a deadly object in a dessert served in plain view, knowing full well someone might see?" The vicar hesitated, his grip tightening around his hat. "Unless," she continued, "the person who slipped it in knew exactly which slice was which, and which guest would sit where. That would suggest planning, and planning suggests intent." Beatrice's lips parted. "You think I planned this?" "I think someone did," Miss Marple said gently. "Someone with access to the kitchen. Someone who knew how to time a substitution. Someone who understood that a coin, poorly placed, could kill more cleanly than poison." She turned to the vicar again. "Tell me, Reverend, did Major Brent have enemies?" He swallowed. Not that I knew of." "No lovers' quarrels? Old wounds? Betrayals?" "No," he said, then paused. "Although there was something years ago." With Ada March, Miss Marple's brows rose. "Do tell." The vicar hesitated. "It's not really my place. But he jilted her. Long ago. Cruelly, they said. She never married after." Marple nodded slowly. Then perhaps we're looking in the wrong direction altogether. A false lead, like a misplaced handkerchief, or a second coin." She stepped toward the window, gazing out into the gloom. "I do believe the key lies not in who died," she said softly, "but in who didn't." Behind her, neither the widow nor the vicar spoke, but one of them, Miss Marple knew, had just stopped breathing for half a second, just long enough for the truth to blink through. The deception had begun to crack. Now she simply had to dig her knitting needles in and pull the threads apart. The morning after her second visit to Hawthorne Cottage, Miss Marple requested Sergeant Carrick's help in arranging a series of polite but pointed conversations with the Christmas dinner guests. She asked for nothing official, just a quiet gathering in the vicarage sitting room where each attendee might be heard separately over a cup of weak tea. The vicar, reluctantly complicit, agreed to host. Miss Marple arrived early and took her seat near the fireplace, a small notebook in her lap, though she rarely wrote in it. Carrick stood to the side, arms folded, watching quietly. There was no interrogation, no harshness, just the same gentle manner with which Miss Marple had coaxed secrets out of vicars' wives and village shopkeepers for decades. First to arrive was Julian Fletcher, the solicitor. He was a man of neatness and restraint, buttoned up in both speech and dress, and he entered the room with an air of forced calm. "I still can't quite believe it," he said, taking the chair across from Miss Marple. "Percival was the sort to outlive us all, wasn't he? Hard as old boots." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "And you've attended these Christmas dinners before?" "Every year since I moved to Kingsbridge," Fletcher said. "Beatrice is a dear friend. I was close to her husband." "And the pudding? Was it always served the same way?" "Always. She brings it in herself, lights the brandy, serves each slice." "Did you see her slip anything into it this time?" Fletcher blinked. "No, certainly not." "You seem quite sure." He hesitated. "Well, I was sitting next to Ada. We were talking about some church fundraiser. I wasn't watching too closely." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "You and Miss March. Close, are you?" A faint colour touched his cheeks. "We see each other at events. She's sharp. I admire her." "And the Major? Was he in good spirits?" Fletcher's jaw tightened just slightly. "He was himself. Loud. Over fond of port. He made a rather cruel joke about Beatrice's age." "And Ada?" Miss Marple watched his face. "What sort of joke?" "Oh, I wouldn't repeat it." "But you remember it?" "Yes." "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. You've been very helpful." He rose stiffly and left, his footsteps quick and clicking on the hallway tile. Ada March was next, a tall, stern woman with sharp eyes behind rimless glasses. She sat upright, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her grief was cold and controlled like the rest of her demeanour. "I'm still not convinced it was murder," she said firmly. "He choked. It happens to elderly men with too much brandy in their systems." "But you found the sixpence in your slice, did you not?" She paused. "Yes, I did. I always find it. Beatrice says I have the luck of the draw." "Did she place your slice in front of you directly?" "She always does. It's a formality." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And you were sitting where, exactly?" "At the far side of the table, between Julian and the vicar." "Not opposite Major Brent?" "No, he was closer to Beatrice, head of the table." "Did you see the pudding before it was served?" "I saw her pour the brandy and light it. We applauded as usual. Then she brought the dish around." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Did Percival say anything to you? Before he died?" Ada's lips pressed tightly. He made a crude comment about how I must have hidden the coin in my purse since I could never afford real silver. "And how did you reply?" "I didn't." She stiffened. "He always enjoyed humiliating people. It was part of his charm, I suppose." "But you didn't seem charmed." "I endured him." Miss Marple's tone remained soft. "And now," Ada's eyes were flint, "now I can enjoy my Christmas dinner without insults." "Thank you," said Miss Marple. The next was Reverend Hargrove, who entered looking sleep-deprived and nervous. He twisted his wedding ring as he sat. "I'm sorry if I seem out of sorts," he said quickly. "But all this questioning, it's just so unnecessary. A tragedy, yes, but not a crime. No, I mean, I don't think so. Beatrice is a deeply kind woman, devout. She would never—" "No one's accusing her," said Miss Marple with a serene smile. "Tell me, Reverend, did you notice anything unusual at dinner? Anything out of place?" Hargrove shook his head. "Only that Percival was louder than usual. He mocked Julian's moustache, and poor Ada, of course. But that wasn't strange. That was Percival." "Did he argue with Beatrice?" "No," the vicar said slowly. "But there was a moment, after the pudding. She was looking at him oddly. I assumed it was indigestion." "You thought she was ill?" "No, I mean, yes, for a second. Then she seemed fine." "You mentioned the flowers yesterday," Miss Marple said gently. "You seemed nervous." His hands clenched. It wasn't about the flowers. Then what was it? Reverend Hargrove's mouth opened, then closed. I overheard something the night before the dinner. Go on. I was at the church, late. Beatrice came in, said she'd forgotten to drop off the candles for the Christmas service, but she wasn't alone. She met Julian Fletcher in the side hall. They didn't know I was there. And what did you hear? They were arguing. She said something about a will, about changing things back before it's too late. Then she saw me and stopped talking. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. That's very helpful. Thank you, Reverend. He looked relieved, almost unburdened. As he left, Sergeant Carrick let out a quiet whistle. Interesting, he muttered. Quite, said Miss Marple. The last to arrive, fashionably late despite the circumstances, was Beatrice Ellingham herself. I understand you've been very thorough, she said as she entered. Interviews and all. Should I be nervous? Only if you've something to hide, said Miss Marple gently. Let's talk about the will. Beatrice's smile didn't waver, but her fingers tugged at her glove. I don't know what you mean. Julian Fletcher is your solicitor, yes? You intended to leave something to Ada March, or perhaps to Reverend Hargrove's Restoration Fund. And Percival objected? Beatrice's voice chilled. It was none of his business. He believed Horace's estate should remain strictly military. No frivolities, no sentimentalities. But Horace and I had no children. I wanted to choose differently. You argued. He made threats. He said he'd contest it. Drag my name through the mud. I told him I'd already signed the new papers. You hadn't. No, she admitted. I was waiting until after the holidays. Miss Marple studied her. So the pudding was prepared, the guest list fixed, and someone at that table knew about the new will, and knew what would happen if it went through. Beatrice's eyes glittered. You think one of them did it? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She watched the widow, then turned slowly to Sergeant Carrick. 4 versions of the same night, she said, and yet not one can say for certain who got which slice, except perhaps for the person who made sure they did. Carrick nodded. You think it was planned? I think, Miss Marple said softly, someone knew exactly what slice to serve, and they let fate, or pudding, take the blame. The contradictions were subtle. Ada claimed to have received the coin, but Julian had said he wasn't watching closely. The vicar had seen a strange look pass between Beatrice and the Major, but not until after he began to choke, and the widow herself was beginning to sound less like a grieving hostess and more like someone who'd won a battle without lifting a finger. Somewhere in those voices the truth had whispered. Miss Marple only had to find where it had spoken loudest, without meaning to. A thick fog had settled over Kingsbridge by the time Miss Marple returned to her guest house, the kind that seemed to soak through the wool of one's coat and make the hearth feel especially welcome. But warmth did little to ease her thoughts that evening. She sat by the fire, her knitting forgotten on her lap, as the puzzle played itself out in her mind. Not a question of how, not any more, but of why. It was a knotted tapestry of motives, every thread leading in a different direction. There was Julian Fletcher, the solicitor, calm, courteous, but undeniably evasive. He had the most to lose, financially speaking, if Beatrice changed her will. If Ada March were to inherit even a portion, that meant less for others, perhaps even himself, if there had been an informal understanding. Fletcher was a man who dealt in clean lines and guarantees. A will left unfinalised was a threat to order. He might have felt justified in preventing that change, especially if he believed others were manipulating Beatrice in her old age. Then there was Ada herself. The woman had motive of a different kind, wounded pride, lingering bitterness. The entire village seemed to know about her history with Major Brent. Public humiliation decades ago, no apologies ever offered, just his smirking face arriving at Christmas every year to remind her. But would Ada, a woman known for her discipline, stoop to murder? There had been fire in her voice, yes, but fire alone did not prove a crime, and she had claimed the sixpence, perhaps to deflect suspicion, perhaps to assert her innocence before anyone asked. The Reverend, too, couldn't be dismissed. His reaction at the vicarage, The way his voice had trembled when he recalled the conversation he wasn't meant to hear. It suggested guilt of some kind. Was it guilt for what he'd heard, or for something more active? He hadn't come forward earlier. He'd waited. And perhaps the argument he overheard had frightened him. Beatrice had trusted him enough to confide in him over the years. Could he have taken it upon himself to ensure her legacy remained untarnished? And Beatrice Ellingham herself, the poised widow. On the surface, she seemed the least likely to risk her station, her name, everything she had worked to maintain since her husband's death. But she was also the only person who controlled the pudding from beginning to end, the only one who knew where each slice would go, and the only one who stood to gain something deeply personal from the Major's death. Not money, but peace. The end of something long-standing and quietly corrosive. Miss Marple rose from her chair and went to her writing desk. She sketched 4 names in her neat hand: Julian, Ada, Lionel, Beatrice. She began listing motives beneath each one. Julian. Threatened by will change, financial implications, possibly close with Ada. Ada, past humiliation by the Major, possible exclusion from previous wills, sudden claim of the sixpence. Lionel, knowledge of the will argument, guilt over inaction, potentially protecting Beatrice. Beatrice, power over the dinner, long-standing bitterness with the Major, strange calm after the death. Each had reason. Each had opportunity, albeit in different ways. But something still didn't fit. Why use a coin? Why not poison? Or a staged fool? Or something less erratic? Unless the coin wasn't meant to be erratic. Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the scene described by the vicar. Beatrice arguing with Julian in the church. The mention of changing things back before it's too late. Julian had downplayed it. But if he'd felt cornered, if he feared Beatrice was being manipulated or making foolish decisions, could he have acted preemptively? And Ada, who claimed to have received the sixpence when the post-mortem revealed it in Percival's throat, that was not just a mistake, it was a lie. But why lie? To divert suspicion, to distance herself from the victim, or to cover for someone else? And that was when the shadow of another possibility crept in. Collusion. What if it wasn't one person acting alone? The lie about the sixpence suggested knowledge of the plan. The timing of the dinner, the seating arrangement. These weren't things easily manipulated without the hostess's cooperation. And Beatrice had, by her own admission, prepared the pudding and served each slice. Yet it had been Ada who announced she'd found the coin. One controlled the dish. The other controlled the story. Miss Marple shivered slightly, though. The fire was still warm. The idea forming was deeply unpleasant, but logical. 2 women, each with their own wounds. Perhaps Ada hadn't intended to kill Percival, but she hadn't stopped it either. And Beatrice, who had years of bitterness and silence stewing beneath her calm exterior, might have seen the chance to act and seized it. But what of the others? The vicar had known something. Julian had been warned. Why hadn't they stopped it? Unless they didn't believe it would go that far. Miss Marple rose again and walked to the window. Outside, the fog had thickened. The lamps along the street glowed like muted stars. She watched the swirling grey for a long moment before speaking aloud to no one but herself. "It's not about hatred," she murmured. "It's about silence. Every person at that table knew something. Every one of them held their tongue." She could feel it now, the shape of the truth. The Major's death had not been one person's plan, but the result of a conspiracy of stillness. A room full of old ghosts, grudges, secrets, all simmering under the surface. It only took one moment, one slice of pudding, for the dam to break. The next day, Miss Marple returned to the cottage. Beatrice answered the door in her usual calm way, though the deep lines round her eyes seemed more pronounced. "I imagine you've come to ask more questions," she said, not unkindly. "No," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. "I've come to tell you a story." Beatrice paused. "A story?" "Yes, about a woman who lived with a terrible presence in her life for far too long. A man who humiliated her friends, who drank too much and spoke too freely. A man who once, in some drawing room or garden party decades ago, said something so vile to a young woman that she never forgot it. And who then continued, year after year, to show up at her table and remind her of everything she'd endured. Beatrice said nothing. In the end, this woman decided not to tolerate it anymore. She had help, perhaps not in action, but in silence. Others saw, but did not interfere. And when the moment came, she served a dish that would finally bring peace to her household. Beatrice's voice was barely a whisper. "And what happens to this woman in your story?" Miss Marple met her eyes. "That depends on whether she continues pretending it was all an accident, or whether she tells the truth and lets the village see that it wasn't madness or malice, but mercy." The air between them went very still. "I'll make tea," Beatrice said finally. "Would you like a slice of cake?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, thank you, dear. I think I've had quite enough sweets for this season." The maze of motives had revealed itself, not through confrontation, but through understanding. Each thread in the web had been spun from guilt, fear, pride, and long-held pain. And at its centre was not a murderer, but a room full of people who had all, in their own way, served death that Christmas night. It was the morning of January 2nd when Sergeant Carrick knocked briskly on the door of Miss Marple's guest house, a folded sheaf of papers in one hand and an unusual spark of confidence in his eyes. The rain had finally broken overnight, leaving behind a sky of glassy blue and a thin crust of frost on the windowsills. Miss Marple, who had just finished tying a lavender ribbon into her knitting basket, opened the door with a gentle smile. "I have good news," Carrick said, stepping inside with barely contained eagerness. "I believe we've solved it." "Oh," she said, quietly intrigued. "How remarkable. So soon." Carrick unfolded the papers and laid them on the table. "We received the final report from the forensic team. They analysed the sixpence that was lodged in Major Brent's throat. Guess what they found? A faint residue of silver polish. Recent application. Suggests it was handled separately. Deliberately placed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, I rather thought it might have been." "Well, that's not all." Carrick tapped another page. It was wrapped in a square of waxed paper. Traces remained on the edges. Microscopic. It wouldn't have stayed in the pudding naturally. Someone planted it. Miss Marple poured a cup of tea, motioning for him to sit. Carrick continued, the words tumbling out. "And get this, we found a second sixpence, the real one, still wrapped in Ada March's napkin. She never turned it over to us, but she mentioned it in her statement, remember?" Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "Indeed, I do remember." Carrick leaned back, satisfied. "So it's simple. She lied. She knew she didn't get the coin from the pudding, which means she must have known there were two, which means she knew there was a deadly one, maybe even switched the real coin with the rigged one herself." He gave her a triumphant look, but Miss Marple's face remained serene. "A bold theory," she said. "A clear one," he insisted. "I'm putting in for her arrest this afternoon. Motives there. Humiliation by Brent. Old bitterness. She was the only one close enough to see him eat the slice. She could have nudged it toward him." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "And yet," she said, almost to herself, "why lie about the coin? If she did kill him, why claim to have received the sixpence at all? Wouldn't it have made more sense to say nothing?" Carrick hesitated. "Well, maybe she panicked. Wanted to look innocent." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "But that would mean she made two separate, deliberate choices. First to kill, and second to fabricate a detail that only increased suspicion." Carrick didn't answer at once. "There's more," he said eventually. "I found out she wrote to Julian Fletcher last year, asking for help drafting a personal will, for some niece or cousin, someone in Yorkshire. It was odd, because she has no close family, but she was insistent. Julian refused, said it was outside his scope." "Refused?" Miss Marple echoed. "Yes, and the letter's still in Julian's files. But it shows she had motive. She needed money. And if Beatrice's new will was going to include her, well, it makes sense." Miss Marple set her teacup down, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Did you ask Julian why he kept the letter?" Carrick blinked. Why would he?" "Because it's dated," Miss Marple said, "and that date tells us something very important." Carrick leaned forward. "What?" But she didn't answer. Not yet. Her eyes had gone distant, following an invisible thread through the tapestry of their case. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, troubled. "I think someone wanted us to find that letter, Sergeant." Carrick looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes people plant more than just evidence. Sometimes they plant stories." That afternoon, as Carrick prepared to deliver the official arrest order to Miss Ada March, a crowd of villagers had already begun to buzz with speculation. Word had spread, too quickly. Ada was seen at the butcher's in the morning, red-eyed but stiff-backed, and by noon half the parish suspected her of murder. Miss Marple stayed behind. She did not like the taste of the solution laid before her. It was too neat, too self-contained. Ada March had lied, yes, but the lie felt less like deception and more like misdirection, born of fear or guilt, but not of malice. And the true puzzle, still unsolved, was the coin, 2 sixpences, one real, one deadly, and the key, the waxed paper. A clever murderer would know that coins didn't remain clean in pudding. A clever murderer would protect their weapon, then remove the wrapper afterward. But this one hadn't. Why? Unless they wanted it found, wanted it traced. Miss Marple's mind turned once again to Julian Fletcher, the fastidious man with immaculate shoes, an orderly desk, and, apparently, a suspiciously preserved letter tucked away for future leverage. His story, too, had been too smooth. Every answer ready, every memory rehearsed. She recalled the quiet glance he'd shared with Ada during questioning. Not affection, but something stranger. Collusion? Number something else. Compassion. Miss Marple left the guest house shortly before dusk and made her way to Fletcher's modest office above the bank. The secretary, surprised but respectful, let her in at once. Fletcher was there, alone, a pen poised in one hand as he reviewed some papers. "Miss Marple," he said, startled. "Is something the matter?" She didn't sit. She remained standing, framed in the doorway like a quiet verdict. "I think you planted the letter," she said. Julian blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The letter from Ada March. You dated it a year back, but the stationery she used didn't exist until May. The watermark gives it away. You forged it." A pause. "Why would I do such a thing?" "To protect her. Because you believe she deserves the money Beatrice promised her. Because you knew the others wouldn't see her that way. And because you thought she'd be blamed." Julian slowly set his pen down. "She didn't do it, Miss Marple." "No," she said, "but you feared she would be accused, so you gave them something else to chase. But in doing so, you helped the real killer slip away." His jaw tightened. "Then who did it?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not certain yet," she admitted. "But it wasn't Ada. And I suspect the person who did kill Major Brent is still watching, waiting to see if the blame sticks." A silence fell. Julian rose and stepped around his desk. He looked exhausted, but there was no guilt in his eyes, only sorrow. "I only wanted to keep her safe," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you, but your false trail has given the murderer a shield. And now they may strike again, if not with poison or pudding, then with fear." That evening, as the village church bells rang softly in the distance, the charge against Ada March was postponed, pending further inquiry. And in the shadowed corners of Kingsbridge, someone who had tasted victory smiled, unseen, knowing they had bought themselves just a little more time. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying a sharp edge that cut through the bare branches of the elms lining Kingsbridge's main street. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage parlour once more, the fire sputtering low as Sergeant Carrick leafed through the old parish archives. They had returned to basics, sifting through decades of records in search of anything that might illuminate the mystery still shrouding Hawthorne Cottage. "Look at this," Carrick said, pointing to a brittle yellowed newspaper clipping dated nearly 30 years earlier. The headline read, "Local Scandal, an Elopement and a Broken Promise." Beneath it was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable, a younger Beatrice Ellingham, eyes sharp and proud, standing beside a man none other than Percival Brent, then a junior officer, handsome and full of bravado. Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. This was long before the Colonel's death. Carrick continued reading aloud. Percival Brent, then only recently commissioned, had been engaged to Ada March, the schoolmistress, for 2 years. But shortly before their wedding, he disappeared with Beatrice, who was newly widowed. The broken engagement left Ada devastated, and the village gossiping for months. Miss Marple folded her hands. So, the past is not as buried as it seemed. She looked at the clipping again, then at Carrick. The old wound between Ada and Percival, the bitterness we sensed at the dinner, it is a continuation of this. But what of Beatrice? What was her role then? According to the article, Carrick said, Beatrice and Percival's relationship was brief and scandalous, considered a betrayal by many. The Colonel had died shortly after, and Beatrice moved swiftly to secure her place in society. Miss Marple tapped her fingers. A betrayal, indeed. That explains Ada's bitterness, and perhaps the Major's brazen presence at the dinner. But it also suggests something deeper. An old grudge, yes, but also unfinished business. Carrick flipped to another page. There's a record here of a disputed inheritance too. Apparently the Colonel left most of his estate to Beatrice, with a clause that it would revert to his family if she remarried. She never did, but there were whispers of secret negotiations. Miss Marple's gaze softened but remained sharp. That explains why the will was such a contentious issue recently. If the Major thought Beatrice's control was illegitimate, and Ada felt wronged by past love and inheritance, it could set the stage for conflict. But what about Reverend Hargrove? Carrick asked. We've talked about him, but I don't see any connection here. Miss Marple looked up from the papers, her eyes clear. But that's where you are mistaken. The Reverend is more intertwined with this than anyone suspected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded letter. This was found tucked away in the vicarage's old records, a confession of sorts from the late Colonel, written months before his death. He expressed deep concern about Beatrice's influence on Percival, warning that the young Major was becoming reckless under her sway. Carrick whistled softly. So, the Reverend inherited more than just a parish from the Colonel, perhaps a family secret. Yes, and his hesitation during questioning makes more sense now. He's been protecting the legacy of the Ellinghams, while grappling with his own conscience. Miss Marple paused, gathering the threads. What we have, Sergeant, is a family saga disguised as a murder. The grudges, the inheritance, the past lovers, all woven together by pride, fear, and old wounds. She rose and paced the room slowly. Major Brent's death wasn't just about a pudding or a misplaced coin. It was the culmination of a decades-long story of betrayal and ambition. And now, the true motive is beginning to show itself. Carrick looked puzzled. But who had the most to gain from the Major's silence? And who had the cunning to turn tradition into a weapon? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That, Sergeant, is what we must uncover next. Outside, the fog thickened again, wrapping the village in its cold embrace as the past's shadow lengthened over Kingsbridge, reminding all who listened that some secrets never truly die. Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage's parlour, the fire's soft glow casting gentle shadows on the walls lined with faded photographs and old hymnals. The weight of the case pressed on her mind, but she knew the truth often hides where no one thinks to look, and sometimes it's the smallest detail that cracks the hardest facade. Her guests for the afternoon were few but carefully chosen. Beatrice Ellingham, Julian Fletcher, Ada March, and Reverend Hargrove. Each had been questioned before, but today Miss Marple planned something different. She had prepared a small experiment, a subtle psychological test designed to disturb the equilibrium that had so far shielded the true culprit. She placed a silver sixpence on the tea table next to the freshly brewed pot and poured a cup for each visitor. The room was filled with the aroma of Earl Grey and faint hints of burning wood. Miss Marple smiled gently. I thought it might be interesting, she began, to revisit the pudding coin, as it were, only this time to observe reactions rather than ask direct questions. Beatrice's fingers tightened around her teacup. Julian's eyes flickered briefly toward the coin. Ada's breath hitched ever so slightly. The Reverend adjusted his collar with a faint tremor. Nothing overt, but a careful observer might note the ripples beneath the surface. Miss Marple continued. You see, a coin is a curious thing, not only for its value, but for what it represents. Luck, tradition, fate. But when placed with intention, it can be a weapon, a symbol, or a secret. She leaned forward. Now, I wonder, if each of you were to receive this coin as a gift, what would you hope it to bring you? Silence fell, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Julian was the first to speak, voice measured. Security, Miss Marple. Stability in uncertain times. Ada's eyes darkened. Freedom. From the past, Beatrice's voice was cool, but edged with something sharp. Peace. Reverend Hargrove looked away momentarily before saying softly, Forgiveness. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then said, Thank you. Now, I have another question, a rather unusual one. Suppose the coin had power beyond its face value. Suppose it could undo harm or deliver justice. How would you use it? Ada shifted in her seat, glancing at Beatrice for a fraction too long. I suppose, to make wrongs right. Julian's jaw tightened. To protect those I care for. Beatrice's lips pressed in a thin line. To silence pain. The Reverend's hands trembled slightly. To seek redemption. Miss Marple smiled gently. These are noble hopes. But sometimes, when faced with loss, people grasp at symbols to hide their true intentions. It's a natural defense. She paused, then set the coin down with deliberate care and stood. Now, there's something else. I wonder if you'd indulge me in a small experiment. They all looked up, curiosity mingling with apprehension. Miss Marple produced a small velvet pouch, identical to one found in the kitchen the night of the dinner. She shook it lightly, producing a faint, distinctive clink. I'd like each of you to reach in, draw out a coin, and tell me what you feel. One by one, the guests reached in. Ada's hand trembled, withdrawing a tarnished penny. She held it tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Julian pulled out a shiny brass token, turning it over thoughtfully. Beatrice's fingers hesitated before producing a small button, cold and heavy in the palm. Reverend Hargrove produced a coin nearly identical to the one on the table, a sixpence polished and unblemished. Miss Marple observed carefully. It was the Reverend's reaction that drew her attention most. His fingers clenched tightly around the coin, knuckles pale. Reverend, she said softly, what does this coin mean to you? He swallowed hard. It belonged to the Colonel. And the Colonel's son, the Major. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. You've carried it with you all these years? He nodded, voice barely audible. A reminder of promises unkept. Miss Marple smiled gently. A burden indeed, and yet a weight one carries willingly until it becomes unbearable. The room was quiet. Suddenly, the Reverend's composure cracked. His hand trembled as he set the coin down on the table, and a flash of pain crossed his face. I wasn't the one who meant to kill him, he whispered, but I might have been the one who handed the coin over. The others stared. I thought I was protecting Beatrice. I believed I was stopping worse things from happening. But the truth is heavier than any coin. Miss Marple reached out, placing a comforting hand on his. Thank you for your honesty, Reverend. It takes courage to lift such a shadow. She looked around the room. The coin was not merely a weapon, it was a message, a link between past and present, and the person who placed it understood that. Her eyes settled on Beatrice. Your calm has been remarkable, Mrs. Ellingham, but I sense it's more than grief. It is control. Beatrice's face remained unreadable. Miss Marple continued. The coin was both literal and symbolic. The killer needed everyone to believe it was a cruel accident, but in reality, it was a carefully placed judgment. The room's tension thickened. Reverend Hargrove's confession changes the shape of the case. It suggests the crime was born not of a sudden impulse, but of long-held burdens. And that burden, perhaps, was shared. A long breath passed through the group. Miss Marple concluded, sometimes the best way to find truth is to unsettle the silence, to watch how people respond when symbols are placed before them, when memories are touched. For it is in those moments the cracks appear. The Reverend bowed his head. Ada wiped her eyes. Julian stared at the floor. Beatrice's fingers curled tightly around the arm of her chair. Miss Marple's eyes softened. We shall see who can bear the weight of truth, and who will crumble beneath it. The dawn mist still clung stubbornly to the village of Kingsbridge when Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage, her steps measured and thoughtful. The investigation had seemed to take a decisive turn the previous afternoon, the Reverend's confession casting new light on the tangled web of secrets. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust such moments of clarity. They often concealed deeper shadows. Inside, Sergeant Carrick was waiting, his face drawn and troubled. He motioned her into the study where the usual neatness had been disturbed. Papers lay scattered across the desk. A small wooden box, once locked, now stood open and empty. The box with the pudding dish's waxed paper fragments, Carrick said grimly. It's gone. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Gone? Yes. Last night it was secured here, catalogued as key evidence, but this morning it was missing. The lock was picked, delicately, professionally. A silence hung between them as the gravity settled in. Who had access? Miss Marple asked. The vicarage staff, the police team guarding it. But none of them have motives. We've already questioned everyone twice. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the first pale light of morning struggled through the fog. Someone is determined to bury the truth, she murmured, or at least delay it. Carrick's frustration was palpable. Without that waxed paper, the link to the coin's origin weakens. It's our strongest physical evidence. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, it is not the only clue. Whoever took it wants us to believe the case is unsolvable. She paced the room, the soft click of her shoes against the wooden floor echoing in the quiet. But people who steal evidence often leave other traces. Let us consider who benefits most. Carrick recounted again the known motives. Ada March's bitterness, Julian Fletcher's legal manoeuvrings, Beatrice's cold composure, and the Reverend's concealed secrets. But none could slip past the police watches unnoticed. Unless someone within the investigation itself, Miss Marple suggested quietly. Carrick blinked, surprised. The most dangerous saboteur is often the one closest, she said. Have you noticed any unusual behaviour among your colleagues? Carrick frowned. Detective Inspector Lacey has been distant, protective of the case, but I thought that was just professionalism. Or a mask, Miss Marple said. Trust is fragile. We must watch carefully. Later that day, she requested a private meeting with Inspector Lacey, under the pretence of reviewing the timeline. The inspector arrived, expression guarded. Miss Marple, he said curtly, what can I do for you? She smiled sweetly. Only to ask a few questions. As they spoke, Miss Marple watched the inspector closely, noting a twitch in his eye and a brief hesitation when she mentioned the waxed paper. When she asked if he had noticed anyone unusual near the evidence, he answered too quickly. Nothing out of the ordinary, I assure you. But surely someone must have been near the box when it vanished, she pressed. Lacey's jaw tightened. I cannot discuss internal matters. Miss Marple tilted her head. Of course. But if I may say, sometimes internal matters are the ones most worth investigating. Later, while examining the vicarage's back corridor, Miss Marple's gaze caught a faint smudge on the wall beside the evidence room door. A partial fingerprint, smudged but still visible. She asked Carrick to have it sent for immediate analysis. The next morning, the results confirmed her suspicion. The print belonged to none other than Inspector Lacey. When confronted, Lacey grew defensive. I was only trying to protect the integrity of the case, he insisted. If evidence leaks, it could ruin the investigation. By stealing it, Miss Marple asked gently. That is not protection, it is obstruction. Lacey's face darkened. You don't understand what's at stake. Then enlighten me, Miss Marple said firmly. Under pressure, Lacey revealed a tangled web of politics and personal loyalties. He had been pressured by a powerful family in Kingsbridge, one with much to lose if the truth about Major Brent's death came out. They demanded a swift resolution, any resolution, to preserve their reputation. I thought removing the evidence would buy time, Lacey confessed. Delay the accusations until the storm passed. Miss Marple shook her head. But justice delayed can become justice denied. The room felt heavy with betrayal. The very system meant to uncover truth had been compromised from within. That evening, the village buzzed with rumours of corruption and cover-ups. Miss Marple realised the stakes had grown beyond a single death. They now encompassed the fragile trust of an entire community. As she sat by the fire later, her thoughts turned to the missing waxed paper, the stolen truth, and the shadows that had deepened around the case. Someone was watching, waiting, and willing to destroy anything that threatened their carefully woven lies. Miss Marple knew the path ahead would be steeper and darker, but with patience, keen eyes, and a steady heart, she was ready to follow the trail, no matter where it led. The tension in Kingsbridge was growing thicker by the hour. Miss Marple rarely allowed herself to be unnerved, but there was something distinctly troubling about how the case had shifted. The theft of the waxed paper had revealed rot within the investigation itself, and Inspector Lacey's disgrace had left Sergeant Carrick to shoulder the investigation alone. Yet, even as Lacey was escorted away in silence, Miss Marple felt no closer to the true culprit. She had exposed a pawn, not a king. The villagers watched her now with both hope and unease, as if they sensed that the storm was far from over. That storm came the next morning. It began with a scream. Miss Marple had just finished her morning tea when the housemaid from the Grange, Julian Fletcher's estate, came bursting into the high street, dress muddied, face pale as chalk. "He's gone," she cried, sobbing uncontrollably. "Mr. Fletcher is gone. Blood in the study. Oh, there was blood." Carrick and Miss Marple arrived at the Grange within minutes. The study was in chaos. Books scattered, drawers pulled violently from their cabinets, and there, soaking into the wool rug before the hearth, a large, dark stain. Blood, but no body. None of the doors were forced, Carrick muttered grimly, inspecting the shattered paperweight on the floor. There was a struggle, but only one set of muddy footprints. Leaving, not entering. "And the windows?" Miss Marple asked. "All locked from the inside." Miss Marple's eyes moved across the room, noting the broken quill, the scorched edge of a half-burned letter in the fireplace, and a curious detail: the safe behind the painting had been left slightly ajar. She stepped closer. Inside were legal ledgers, bundles of notes, and a silver penknife, clean and polished, placed precisely on top. "Julian Fletcher," she said quietly, "was not murdered here." Carrick turned sharply. "You believe he staged this?" "I believe someone wants us to think he was murdered." The discovery sent Kingsbridge into frenzy. First Major Brent's murder, then Inspector Lacey's exposure, and now a bloody disappearance. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, shops closed early, and the church bells rang too solemnly for a Sunday morning. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat quietly in the Reverend's parlour, puzzling through the pattern that had eluded her for too long. There was something in the connections, a rhythm to the crimes, as if they were following a carefully composed symphony. First a murder, then the removal of evidence, now a vanishing act. It wasn't just escalation, it was orchestration. She turned her attention to the half-burned letter recovered from Julian's study. Only a few words had survived. "Cannot let the matter rest, not while she lives. If she speaks..." Miss Marple's breath caught. She, Ada March, Beatrice, Eleanor the housekeeper, or someone else entirely. Before she could voice her thoughts, a knock came at the door. It was Beatrice Lane. She looked unusually dishevelled, her gloves missing, her coat hastily thrown over a dressing gown. "You must come at once," she said, voice trembling. "It's Ada. She was found unconscious at the old chapel ruins." They found Ada March sprawled across the cold stone floor of the ruined chapel on the edge of the moors. Her head was bloodied, but the wound looked more like a blow than a fall. A bloodied iron candlestick lay beside her. "She's alive," Carrick confirmed, checking her pulse. "Unconscious, but alive." Miss Marple crouched beside the prone woman. Why would someone attack her now? Unless... Carrick frowned. Unless she knew something. Miss Marple nodded. Something that made her the next target. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple requested a full list of recent visitors to the Grange. Carrick, though stretched thin, Obliged. The list was long, but one name stood out. Beatrice Lane, Thursday afternoon. Miss Marple pressed her fingertips together. That visit had been unmentioned until now. Why would Beatrice, Julian's former fiancée, and a woman so coolly indifferent to the entire affair, visit the man who had broken off their engagement just days before his disappearance? And then Ada, who had held a deep, unspoken bitterness toward Beatrice, was attacked. The timing was too neat to be chance. Miss Marple called Beatrice to the vicarage. The woman arrived with icy poise, her tone carefully modulated. "You wish to see me?" "Yes," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "to ask about your visit to Mr. Fletcher's estate last Thursday." Beatrice's composure cracked, just slightly. Her mouth tightened, her hands folded a touch too tightly. "I dropped off a letter. Nothing more." Miss Marple nodded. "A private letter?" "Yes." "Did he reply?" "No." "And did you see Ada March that evening?" "I did not." Miss Marple studied her carefully, then said gently, "You do realise, of course, that Ada was attacked within an hour of Julian Fletcher's disappearance?" Beatrice's hands twitched. "She was trying to find something," Miss Marple continued. "She told me so the day before. Something in the chapel. It may have been a note, or something buried." Miss Marple leaned forward. "And if I were to return to the chapel now, I suspect I would find that whatever she nearly uncovered is now gone." Beatrice stood. "This is absurd." "It's very nearly over," Miss Marple said calmly, "but not quite." That night, Miss Marple returned alone to the chapel. She carried a lantern and a notebook, and wore gloves against the biting wind. The ruins were eerily silent, the air tense with memory and fear. At the base of the altar, disturbed stones showed signs of recent movement. She knelt and dug carefully until her fingers found something soft and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a bundle of letters, brittle with age, sealed with the Brent family crest. Miss Marple opened the first and froze. It was a confession. A decades-old letter from Julian Fletcher's father to Major Brent, blackmailing him over a war crime committed in France. The Major had paid to keep the past hidden, and Julian had just uncovered it. The entire estate, the power he wielded in Kingsbridge, it was all built on buried guilt. And someone else knew. Miss Marple rose slowly. The real question wasn't who killed Major Brent. It was, who stood to lose everything if the truth about Julian's inheritance came out? The answer, Miss Marple now realised, was not Julian Fletcher. It was Beatrice Lane. The game was not over. Not yet. But for the first time, Miss Marple had her queen in sight, and the final move was about to begin. Miss Marple sat in the study of Greenhollow Cottage, her fingers wrapped lightly around a cup of weak tea, her eyes distant. The warmth of the fire crackled beside her, but her thoughts were far colder, drifting through the events that had upended this quaint village Christmas. The first death had unsettled the village, Sir Cedric's sudden collapse at dinner, the poisoned plum pudding, the gathering of suspects in a single snow-locked house. Then, just as her suspicions sharpened, Miss Barnes was struck down in the night, her lips curled in a rictus of fear. The village had begun to whisper. The killer, it seemed, was not yet done. Inspector Cray had resumed his investigations with renewed urgency after Miss Barnes's death, yet his confidence had visibly shaken. What had seemed an open and shut case now sprawled with contradiction and confusion. In his eyes, Miss Marple saw doubt creeping in. She reviewed her notes scribbled in a tidy hand upon hotel stationery. It was something small, a moment, hardly more than a flicker, that began to trouble her. Something Lydia Penrose had said just before Miss Barnes' death. She had been in the kitchen that afternoon, speaking with cook, trying to soothe her frayed nerves after Sir Cedric's murder. Miss Marple had passed through to fetch a shawl and overheard her say, "Well, it's only right to throw away all the leftovers after what happened." Why that comment stuck in her mind now, she wasn't quite sure, but it had the faint odour of something rehearsed, something performative. Why throw everything out so quickly when food was in short supply and the roads still closed? She stood, setting the teacup aside, and pulled on her shawl. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters of the manor house. Snow blew sideways against the hedgerows, and lights flickered faintly through the curtained windows of Greystone Hall. The villagers were still housed there by necessity. The roads were blocked, the storm unrelenting. They were trapped, and so was the killer. Returning to the manor, she found Inspector Cray in the library, poring over a report with a furrowed brow. "There's something I'd like to test, Inspector," she said softly. Cray blinked at her, adjusting his spectacles. "Yes, Miss Marple?" "Would you be so kind as to take me to the kitchen? I'd like to speak with Cook and see what remains of the food." Cray hesitated. "There's not much left. Miss Penrose had everything cleared out after the first murder. Said it was best not to take chances." "Yes," Marple replied evenly. "So I heard." In the kitchen, Cook was wiping down the counters, her hands trembling slightly even days later. She glanced up with tired eyes. "I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said gently. "Just a quick question, if I may. Who threw out the pudding? The original one? The one that was served the night Sir Cedric died?" Cook looked up, startled. "Miss Penrose did, ma'am. I was beside myself, I must admit. She took charge, said the police wouldn't want to risk contamination." "I see. And did she also dispose of the remaining brandy sauce?" Cook hesitated. I believe she did. But that went untouched, didn't it?" Marple smiled faintly. "Not quite." She left Cook and walked slowly back through the hallway. A pattern was beginning to form, faint but undeniable. It had started with the deaths, 2, seemingly unconnected, except by the dinner they shared. Then came the vanishing evidence, the destroyed food, the stolen guestbook pages, and now the comments, so carefully constructed, so practiced. The brandy sauce had not been eaten by Sir Cedric, but it had been plated, placed beside his pudding, yet he hadn't touched it. The poison had not been in the sauce. So why remove it? She entered the drawing room, where Lydia Penrose was seated by the fire, darning a glove. "Mrs. Penrose," she said, settling into a chair beside her, "I must ask, when you took over the disposal of the food, did anyone question your actions?" Lydia looked up, face calm. "Everyone was in such shock, Miss Marple. They were grateful someone was doing something. It seemed necessary." "Indeed, but necessary for whom?" Lydia's stitching paused. "What are you implying?" Marple regarded her carefully. "Only that you have been remarkably swift in directing the flow of information since the night of Sir Cedric's death. You arranged the disposal. You recorded who sat where. You were the first to suggest Miss Barnes had been distraught before her death." Lydia met her gaze coolly. "Someone had to. We were in chaos." "Yes," Marple said softly, "but chaos is a most convenient thing to hide in, wouldn't you say?" The glove slipped from Lydia's hand. Her eyes narrowed, lips tightening ever so slightly. Then she turned away, as if the conversation bored her. Miss Marple rose. "I do hope you'll stay close by, Mrs. Penrose. I suspect we're very near the end." Back in the study, Marple laid out the facts again. 2 deaths. A pudding poisoned with belladonna. Deadly, but hard to detect. A second death by digitalis, taken from Lady Hargreaves' old prescription bottle. 2 poisons, 2 sources, but both requiring knowledge, access, planning. And both victims had ties to Lydia Penrose. Sir Cedric had been her husband's patron once. Miss Barnes, the solicitor's sister, had discovered something and tried to confront her. Miss Marple picked up the guest book, the one Lydia had tried to organise. The pages from the prior Christmas were missing, but not all of them. One had been torn, partially. The ink smeared but legible. December 25th, 1950. Dinner. Sir Cedric L. Penrose, Harold Barnes. Miss Marple's heart thudded. Harold Barnes, the solicitor, he had dined with them last year, and died shortly afterward in a supposed boating accident. But Miss Barnes had said he never went boating, never swam. The pattern emerged, clean and terrible. 3 deaths, each close enough to Lydia Penrose to see her shadow, yet distant enough to escape scrutiny, each with a motive buried just beneath the surface, an inheritance, a property transfer, a silent suspicion, and in each Lydia had inserted herself at just the right moment. She had cast herself as helpful, organised, soothing. Too soothing. It was not 1 murder, it was 3. Miss Marple stood very still. The pattern had always been there, but now, for the first time, it was undeniable. Not just a single crime of passion or opportunity. No, It was a plan, meticulously executed, spread across years, each death folded into the fabric of ordinary tragedy. Only now, with this year's Christmas dinner, had it begun to unravel, and the widow who served death was no stranger to poison. The snow was falling again by the time Miss Marple returned to the vicarage that evening, her boots trailing faint imprints over the frozen path. The villagers, though rattled by the second murder, had begun to settle back into routine, the way people often did when horror became inconvenient. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface of gossip and polite company, something was festering. She sat by the fireplace, knitting untouched in her lap. The motive, she had said to herself earlier, was not money, not jealousy, not mere hatred. It was deeper, older. When she had stared into Evelyn March's lifeless eyes, she'd seen more than panic or pain. She'd seen guilt. That night, she spread out her notes again. Threads linked names to events, past to present. Rupert March, Evelyn March, Gilbert Fisk, even Nora West and the long-dead baby in the graveyard. It was not until she glanced again at the newspaper clipping about young Ruth Armitage, the child said to have died of influenza in 1910, that the truth began to stir in her mind. The name had struck her as oddly familiar, and now she remembered why. It wasn't from a parish record, but from an old, nearly forgotten conversation with Reverend Halberd about the Armitage family who fled the village in shame. Because their daughter, Ruth, had not died of influenza. She'd disappeared. And shortly after, a grieving childless widow named Evelyn Baxter had returned from London with a baby girl, swaddled in cloth and baptized in private. The baby had grown into Miss Nora West. Miss Marple, cheeks flushed with the heat of her revelation, pressed her palms together. If Nora was Ruth Armitage, then the past had returned not as a ghost, but as a grown woman bent on understanding who had buried her identity, and why. The motive, then, was identity. Not money or pride, but the right to know the truth about one's own existence. Evelyn had lied, not just to the child, but to the entire village. Miss Marple could almost hear the echo of Evelyn's soft, clipped voice as she deflected questions. Poor thing, she's mine in all the ways that matter. But that wasn't true. She had taken Ruth in silence, perhaps to escape shame, perhaps out of guilt. Perhaps she had been the cause of the child's disappearance to begin with. Still, that wasn't the whole of it. That kind of lie didn't drive one to murder, unless someone else knew. Unless someone like Gilbert Fisk had uncovered the truth and tried to use it for himself. Miss Marple's mind swirled with the implications. If Gilbert knew Ruth's true identity, he might have blackmailed Evelyn, not for money, but for influence, control. She recalled Gilbert's smugness at the dinner table, the way Evelyn's hands had trembled when she poured the wine. So, Evelyn poisoned him. Then, just as Evelyn thought her nightmare buried, someone else, perhaps Nora, came close to discovering the truth. Nora, who had always sensed the cold distance between herself and the woman who called her daughter, who might have pressed Evelyn for answers, who might have threatened to expose what was hidden beneath the surface. And so Evelyn struck again. Only this time, she made a mistake. Miss Marple recalled the lockbox in Evelyn's study, the one the police had opened with little interest. Inside had been some deeds, papers and letters, but one envelope had been postmarked with an address from Sheffield, Ruth Armitage's supposed birthplace. It contained a letter. Dear Mrs. Baxter, it is with regret that we return your application. Without proof of adoption, Miss Ruth cannot be enrolled at our institution. No adoption papers, no legal claim, only a secret, and a motive strong enough to silence anyone who came too close. Miss Marple didn't sleep that night. She waited until morning before requesting a quiet word with Inspector Cray. To his credit, he listened without interruption as she explained her theory: the kidnapping, the reinvention of a child, the blackmail, the double murder. He paled as she laid out each connection, her gentle voice contrasting sharply with the cruelty of what she described. But you're saying Nora didn't know, Cray muttered. Not really, just suspected. She was searching for something, said Miss Marple, a truth she didn't yet have. But Evelyn feared she might find it. And fear is a powerful thing, Inspector. It makes people do dreadful things. He nodded slowly. We'll re-examine the letters and the bottle. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. One more thing, she said. You need to speak with Reverend Halberd. I believe he kept something from the original baptism, perhaps even the true record of Ruth Armitage's birth. Later that day, the Reverend did produce a hidden record, sealed and placed in his personal ledger long ago. Ruth's baptism under the Armitage name had been struck through, replaced by a second entry under Evelyn Baxter. He admitted he had done so reluctantly, under pressure from Evelyn herself. By evening, the entire picture had fallen into place. Nora West, born Ruth Armitage, was the linchpin of the mystery. Not because she had committed the crime, but because her existence threatened to unravel Evelyn March's carefully constructed lie. Evelyn, already weakened by illness, could not bear the idea of her past destroying her legacy. So she had chosen silence and death. The revelation sent ripples through St. Aldred's. The villagers spoke in hushed tones torn between sympathy for Evelyn and horror at what she had done. Nora, devastated by the truth, left the village shortly after, her final letter to Miss Marple filled with questions she had no language for yet. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer. Some crimes were solved not with handcuffs or confessions, but with painful honesty. And in this case, the motive had not been greed or rage, but something far more tragic, a desperate desire to control a story that was never hers to begin with. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. The snow outside had dulled to a soft hiss, dusting the windows of the Langdon estate like powdered sugar. But inside the drawing room, the air crackled with anticipation. Miss Marple, clad in a pale blue cardigan, and with her lace gloves folded neatly in her lap, sat across from the true villain, watching the flicker in their eyes as the final threads of the web closed in. She had insisted on this confrontation being held here, in the very house where it had all begun. The guests had been sent home, Inspector Cray had reluctantly agreed to her terms, and the room had been cleared of distractions. Only the essential players remained: Miss Marple, Inspector Cray, and the person who had smiled at death and served it for Christmas dinner, Lady Margaret Langdon. The widow sat in her late husband's high-backed chair, a glass of untouched sherry at her elbow. Her gloved fingers curled around a lace handkerchief, her gaze unreadable. Miss Marple began gently, as if recounting a memory. It all started with that ham, didn't it? So odd the way it had been sliced. Not by the housemaid, no. That was your touch, Lady Langdon. Margaret blinked. You can't possibly mean... Oh, but I do. You see, it wasn't the meat, of course. It was the silver tray beneath it, the one that had been wiped clean of fingerprints. A little too clean. Almost everything in this house bore some mark of handling, except that tray. You thought it was clever to prepare it yourself, didn't you? So no servant would need to touch it. So no one would ever guess what had rested there before the meat. Lady Langdon's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her eyes flicked toward Cray, then back. And what had been on the tray before the ham, Miss Marple? The inspector asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. A bottle of laudanum, Miss Marple said, or more precisely the little glass phial that once held it. You remember the phial I found tucked into the hollow leg of the piano bench? An odd place, but not odd if one needed to hide it in a hurry, and if one remembered that Lord Langdon once stored cigars there. Margaret gave a faint laugh. You're building ghosts out of dust, Miss Marple. No, my dear, I'm knitting truth from lies, and this particular thread goes far deeper than anyone expected. You see, the real clue wasn't the laudanum. It wasn't the forged letter, or the unlocked window. It was the poisoner's hands. Miss Marple leaned forward, eyes bright with a cold clarity. You always wore gloves, Lady Langdon. Indoors, outdoors, even while serving dinner. It was winter, of course, but still, every time. I thought it was grief, or affectation, but it wasn't. It was the tremor. Margaret's mask wavered. You've been ill, haven't you? Early onset of something. You dropped a spoon during the toast, your handwriting was uneven in the Christmas cards, even your lipstick smeared at the corner of your mouth when we met. All small things, but together they told a story. A person growing desperate. Afraid. Afraid of what? Margaret whispered. Miss Marple's voice softened. Of being forgotten. Of dying slowly, invisibly, while people only remembered your husband, the great Charles Langdon, the philanthropist, and worst of all, of being penniless, because he intended to cut you off, didn't he? Margaret's lips trembled. He said I'd wasted too much already. You didn't kill him out of hate, Miss Marple continued gently. You killed him out of fear of being discarded like a worn glove. And then you staged the entire dinner, built it like a tableau, so carefully. You poisoned him, and then you sat at the table and watched everyone eat, because you wanted witnesses to a memory, one last grand act. Silence fell. The ticking of the clock behind them filled the room. Margaret rose slowly from the chair. Do you know what it's like, she said, voice cracking, to have your worth measured only by your husband's shadow? I gave him 20 years, and in the end he was going to throw me away for a younger woman. That little pianist. She thought I didn't know. You knew everything, Miss Marple said. Too much, in fact. She would have inherited it all. He changed the will days before. Margaret's voice sharpened with bitterness. But I changed his medicine, a few drops every day, and by Christmas Eve he was already slipping away. I just helped him along. Inspector Cray moved forward to make the arrest, but Miss Marple raised a hand. There's one more thing, she said. Margaret froze. You left a second phial of laudanum in the guest wing. Margaret's brows furrowed. It was meant. For someone else, wasn't it? Miss Marple asked softly. But you couldn't go through with it. Or perhaps you meant to plant it, to make the blame fall elsewhere. Margaret sank back into the chair. I don't know any more. Maybe both. Inspector Cray stepped forward and laid a hand on Margaret's shoulder. You'll come with me now, Lady Langdon. As she was led away, Margaret looked over her shoulder at Miss Marple. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a deep, exhausted sadness. When the door closed, Cray let out a long breath. You had her pegged from the start, didn't you? No, Miss Marple replied. I only knew she was lying, but lies. Lies are like snowflakes, each unique, yet they fall into a pattern, and sooner or later, the truth beneath them begins to melt through. She turned to the cold window and looked out at the garden beyond. A widow who served death for Christmas dinner, she murmured. It would be a tragedy if it weren't also a little poetic. Cray looked at her sidelong. You ever think of retiring? Miss Marple smiled faintly. And give up all this excitement? They both laughed, but it was a quiet, hollow sound muffled by the snow. The case was closed, but the echoes of what had been served that night would linger, bitter and unforgettable. A full moon hung over St. Aldhelm's Hollow, casting long silver shadows across the frost-bitten hedgerows and the crooked lanes. Inside the warm glow of the vicarage parlour, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray in thoughtful silence. The widow, Constance Harrow, had been taken into custody not an hour ago, tears frozen on her cheek, hands trembling as she whispered her confession like a woman reading a prayer from memory. Poisoned plum pudding, a cruel joke on a man who'd ruined lives, stolen from parish funds, blackmailed his own cousin. Elias Harrow, the victim of a slow and bitter vendetta, had met his end at the family's Christmas dinner table, with a smile on his face and a deadly dose of arsenic in his pudding. Or so it seemed. Inspector Cray sighed and leaned back in the vicar's creaky armchair. You've done it again, Miss Marple, he said with reluctant admiration. I was convinced it was young Roland with his missing keys and sudden gambling debts, but you saw straight through it. Miss Marple didn't smile. She kept her eyes on the crackling fire, knitting untouched in her lap. It was too neat, she murmured, too theatrical. Elias Harrow was certainly poisoned, yes, and Constance was certainly angry. But she's not the type. Grudges make her melancholy, not murderous. Cray frowned. She confessed. Yes, she did. That's what worries me. Cray turned toward her. You think she's lying? Not entirely, but she's protecting someone. Think, Inspector. The missing brandy decanter, the smudged fingerprint on the inside rim of the pudding bowl, the odd placement of the second wreath on the garden gate. It's all pointing somewhere else. Someone more calculating. Someone who knew Constance's guilt would be believable. Before Cray could reply, a knock interrupted them. The vicar, looking unusually pale, stepped in with a telegram. This just came, addressed to you, Inspector. Cray read it. brow furrowing. "Good Lord." "What is it?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "It's from the station. They've just gone through Constance's correspondence. Her confession letter to the solicitor, signed and sealed last night, was missing from her desk. In its place was a nearly identical copy, dated 3 days earlier." Miss Marple sat forward, eyes glittering. Someone planted it. Someone who wanted to be sure she took the fall. Cray's face hardened. "Then we're not finished." "No," Miss Marple said, rising, "and I think I know where to look." They returned to the Harrow estate just after midnight. The great hall was silent, haunted now by a different kind of chill. Roland Harrow, thin and wide-eyed, met them in the corridor, breath reeking of brandy. "You've got what you came for," he muttered, voice quivering. "She confessed. What more do you want?" "Truth, dear boy," Miss Marple said gently, stepping past him. "Just truth." In the drawing-room, she ran her hand across the family portrait above the fireplace. "Look here," she said. "This painting, repainted at the edges. Quite recently, wouldn't you say?" Cray moved closer. "The frame's been adjusted too, like it was hiding something." Miss Marple took a poker and tapped lightly on the panel behind the picture. A hollow sound answered. Roland stepped back. "What are you doing?" Cray moved quickly, pulling the painting down and prying the panel open. Inside was a small recess. Letters, dozens of them, handwritten, mostly to Elias. Miss Marple began reading aloud. Blackmail notes signed anonymously. Demands for silence, threats of exposure. She paused. "But this one, this is different." Cray took it from her and read, "I know what you did to Father. If you breathe a word about the inheritance, I swear I'll ruin you like you ruined us." Roland paled. "You've no right—" "Oh, but we do," Cray said. "You had motive, access to the pudding, and knowledge of your mother's resentment. You even knew she'd protect you." Miss Marple turned, face soft but firm. "It wasn't your gambling, was it? It was the house. You were about to lose it. Elias had found out you forged his signature to access the trust." Roland swallowed hard. "He deserved it. The man killed our father, drove him to the grave with shame. He held this family hostage for 20 years. Miss Marple stepped closer. "And so you slipped the poison in, hid the decanter, moved the wreath, planted the confession. You thought it was foolproof. I was right, wasn't I? She would have taken the blame. She loved me too much not to." Miss Marple's voice dropped. "That, dear boy, is your tragedy. Not that you murdered Elias, but that you knew your mother would burn for it, and you were willing to let her." Cray approached slowly, cuffs in hand. "Roland Harrow, I'm arresting you for the murder of Elias Harrow. You do not have to say anything." Roland didn't struggle. He just sat, as if the very breath had gone out of him. And Miss Marple, quiet as ever, turned away from the scene. But just before she crossed the threshold, she glanced down. The rug was shifted again. Slightly, but enough. She knelt. Her fingers brushed the corner, a loose floorboard. She lifted it. Inside, a second, smaller bottle. Not poison. Ink. Cray watched her with confusion. "What's that?" She held up a third letter, crumpled and stained. It wasn't addressed to Elias. It was from him. To Constance. "I'll tell them everything tomorrow. You deserve the estate. I'll set it right." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. He was going to confess. Make amends. The murder wasn't vengeance, it was preemption. Cray blinked. "Then," Miss Marple looked toward the doorway, "then we've arrested the wrong Harrow." And just as the clock struck 1, somewhere down the corridor, a soft click echoed, like the sound of a door closing, or locking. Miss Marple did not speak again. She simply straightened, her face unreadable, and began to walk into the dark. The heavy oak door shut behind Miss Marple with a soft thud, the sound hanging in the cold, silent corridor like a final punctuation. The moonlight outside cast long, ghostly fingers through the stained glass, but inside the Harrow estate shadows deepened where light dared not linger. Inspector Cray's hand hovered over the door handle, then dropped. "She's gone," he said quietly, eyes wide. Roland must have let her slip away. Or worse, she walked out on her own. Miss Marple regarded him with a calm gaze, the faintest smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Yes, Inspector," she did. "Constance Harrow is free. For now." The weight of that statement hung between them, heavy and unsettling. The woman who had confessed, who had seemed the obvious villain, had vanished without a trace. The estate was searched, rooms ransacked again, but there was no sign, no note, no packed bag, no farewell. "It's, disappointing," Cray said, frustration creeping into his voice. She admitted everything. Why run now? "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "there is one last secret she wished to keep buried. The truth behind the deaths, yes, but more than that, the reason why she poisoned Elias Harrow, and why she almost allowed her own son to be arrested for it." Cray frowned, gesturing toward the hearth. "You think there's something we missed? Something we should have seen?" Miss Marple nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out a folded scrap of paper. It was the torn corner of the guest book from that ill-fated Christmas dinner. The page with the smudged ink, so easily dismissed in the rush of chaos. "Look closely," she said, smoothing the paper against the tabletop. "The smudge is not a mistake. It's a clue. A fingerprint pressed too firmly. The shape unmistakable." Cray leaned in, squinting. "A thumbprint?" "Exactly. But it's not Constance's," Miss Marple continued. "Nor Roland's, nor Elias's. It belongs to someone we never suspected. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gilmore." Cray blinked. The loyal housekeeper. But she was so frightened, so compliant. Precisely why she was overlooked. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Mrs. Gilmore held the keys to more than just the house. She had access to the kitchen, the pantry, the medicine cabinet, and she hated the Harrows, not for money or revenge, but for the cruelty they showed to those they deemed beneath them. Cray sat back, stunned. "You're saying she was the mastermind?" Miss Marple nodded. "She orchestrated the poisonings, slipping the deadly substances into the pudding and the sherry. She manipulated Constance's fragile state, planting ideas of betrayal and revenge. And when Elias prepared to confess his wrongdoings and make amends, Mrs. Gilmore ensured silence was permanent. But why let Constance confess? Or Roland be arrested? Because it suited her purposes. Chaos and suspicion fractured the family and village alike, and in the confusion she could cover her tracks. Constance, racked with guilt and manipulated, took the fall willingly. Roland, desperate and foolish, was her perfect scapegoat. Cray shook his head. Then Constance ran because she realized she was a pawn. Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Yes, and Mrs. Gilmore, she remains in this very house, smiling and waiting." A sharp knock startled them, and a maid entered cautiously, pale and breathless. "Miss Marple, Inspector, there's been a sighting. Mrs. Gilmore was seen near the east gate speaking with a man in a dark coat. They left together toward the river." The room went silent. The final piece of the puzzle had slipped through their fingers. Miss Marple stood, her composure unshaken. Justice, Inspector, is not always swift, nor is it always certain, but the truth endures, waiting to be uncovered again, whenever shadows lengthen. Cray looked at her with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "Will she be caught?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted in the firelight. "Eventually, perhaps, or perhaps not. But we will know who she is, and that knowledge is the beginning of justice." Outside, the snow began to fall once more, cloaking the village in white silence. Inside, the mystery remained unresolved, but the light of truth had pierced the darkness, even if only just. And in that, there was hope. Ask ChatGPT. The dawn crept quietly over St. Aldhelm's Hollow, pale and hesitant, against the heavy curtains of the vicarage. Miss Marple stood by the window, a slender silhouette outlined against the softening night. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched the village stir awake, the world seeming peaceful again. But beneath that calm surface, ripples still moved unseen. Inspector Cray shuffled papers on the cluttered desk behind her, his face still marked by fatigue and frustration. The case of the poisoned Christmas dinner had closed with no neat bow. The true culprit vanished into the mist. Constance Harrow's flight and Mrs. Gilmore's escape had left more questions than answers, and the village was left to nurse its wounds in silence. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the guest book's torn corner, the one she had kept folded carefully in her coat pocket. The smudged fingerprint, the hidden letter beneath the painting, the secret meeting near the east gate, each piece a thread in a tapestry still unfinished. She turned from the window, her eyes catching the soft light reflecting off a small object on the mantel, a delicate silver thimble inconspicuously nestled among the holiday ornaments. She picked it up, turning it over between her fingers, and the familiar sense of unease tightened in her chest. That thimble wasn't Mrs. Gilmore's. It belonged to Nora West, the same Nora who had left the village months ago, carrying with her questions too painful to ask aloud, and a letter to Miss Marple filled with uncertainty. Had Nora truly disappeared of her own accord? Or was she connected to the shadowy figures who had haunted the Harrow estate? Had she known more than she said? And if so, what had become of her? Miss Marple folded the thimble carefully and slipped it into her handbag. "Inspector," she said softly, "this case may have settled for now, but I suspect the story isn't finished." There are still whispers beneath the silence. Cray looked up, brow furrowed. "You think there's more to come?" "Always," she smiled, the faintest glimmer of anticipation in her eyes. Murder and mystery, like the tides, never truly cease. They ebb and flow, revealing themselves to those willing to look closely enough. The two shared a quiet moment, the fire crackling low in the hearth. As the morning light stretched across the village rooftops, Miss Marple gathered her coat and handbag. Her steps were light but determined as she stepped outside, the cold air crisp and bracing. A path lay ahead, winding and uncertain. But for Miss Marple, the pursuit of truth was never ending. And somewhere, just beyond the edges of the village, another secret waited to be uncovered. The mystery never ends. She smiled, and with that, she disappeared down the lane, the soft crunch of her footsteps mingling with a whisper of the waking world.